Hello, everybody. How's everyone doing? I hope you're all well and safe and happy at the moment. Welcome if it's your first time to some art classes. Welcome back if it's not your first time. And I hope you're enjoying this series. Today is going to be looking at hands and feet and cheese. So hopefully that was enough to draw you along. And just a quick recap. So yesterday, no, 2 days ago, we were looking at likeness and portraiture and really focusing on the triangle between the two eyes and the tip of the nose. And your challenge was to look at two different photos of you from two generations, one when you were a little kid and one as an adult maybe, or a teenager, and see whether that triangle had changed. And hopefully that's going to be something which you can put into use next time you're doing a self-portrait or next time you're drawing or painting somebody's portrait. That was really about looking and trying to focus on something specific to try and get likeness. We were also talking about how to start a portrait painting or a drawing. So there were two parts to that tutorial. And I guess there are going to be two parts to this class as well. I did a poll on Twitter which asked which you had more difficulty with. Did you have more difficulty with hands or with feet? And the results were 60% said hands and 40% said feet. So we're going to start with hands and then we're going to move on to feet. So hopefully that will be something useful which you can put into your next painting or drawing. And look, I think the way that I'm approaching this always is to not try and make some flashy drawings so that you can convince somebody that you're this amazing artist. It's more really to try and suggest different ways of looking at things and try and get you guys to notice things which you might not normally notice, or focus on something that maybe is more important than something else, no matter whether we're looking at color, whether we're looking at portraiture, or landscape. It's about seeing the world differently and trying to use these tools that I'm trying to suggest when you next attempt a piece of artwork. So with that in mind, let's get started with today. So hands and feet. I don't know about you, but when I'm drawing a portrait of something, of somebody, the thing that I always leave till last will be the hands. I don't know what it is, but they make me kind of panic a little bit when I paint somebody. I would say I'd always try and include them in the painting or drawing, but I think just their complexity makes me just anxious. And I want to either leave them to the end, which is probably not a good idea because I'll rush it, or just, like any displacement activity, focus on something else rather than really grappling with them and addressing them. So hopefully today I'm going to suggest some things which you might find a little bit easier when it comes to tackling hands, first of all. So the first thing I want to ask you is, how big in relation to the rest of the body do you think hands are? I'm asking you that question because I think a lot of people think that hands are quite small in relation to the rest of the body. So when we're doing a painting or a drawing, proportion is really key because it's key in terms of getting likeness. But if you're doing a life drawing or life painting, it's also really key in terms of getting convincing proportions. So look at this. My hand is as big as my head. And I think when you're thinking about your painting or your drawing, or just even generally, I think we think of hands as being quite small, but actually they're quite big in relation to other parts of our body. So just think about that next time you're doing a painting or a life drawing. That's really the tip number one, is that your hand is as big as your head, or as the subject's head. Okay, so that's the first thing that I want you to have in your head. That's a little tip. Okay, so let's get started here. I think the easiest way is always going to be to draw around your hand. So that's the point that we're starting at today. And what I want to do, I want to focus on really, really simplifying this. So I drew around my hand earlier, and I want us to break this complicated shape down into some separate parts. So the first thing I want to think about is the shape of the palm. I need to get that a little bit bigger, just hold on a sec. So let's, sorry, that's too big now. Right, let's think about this shape here. Where the wrist is, that's the first shape that we can start with. So when you're looking at your own hand, whether you're looking at the front or you're looking at the back, just think about that shape. Now remember, shape is two-dimensional and form is three-dimensional. And we'll get onto that in a minute. But really what I want you to think about is just trying to simplify these really, really complicated parts down. So at the top edge here, you have 4 knuckles. And then if we look at our fingers, we have some other knuckles that go here, 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 and here. And they're connected by a straight line. And I guess that might be represented by one brushstroke when you're painting. Or it could be that top part. And then there is the tip of the fingers. And then there's another straight line that goes from this first joint to that second joint, to that second part of the knuckle there. And then there's another part to the fingertip itself. Now, I don't want to draw a skeleton and I don't want to get into anatomy really, but I do want us just to think about, we're not drawing 4 sausages or 5 sausages that are attached to another piece of meat. These are articulated, complicated joins. But I think if we can start with that first shape that I've drawn here and think about that, then connecting to a wrist. And then from there, there's also a thumb. So that really is the first thing I'd like you to think about, depending on whether the hand is coming towards you, is flat, is at an angle. Really just try and look for that first shape. It's this part here, this first part of the shape. So let's get rid of that for a sec. So I think the next exercise you could think about is starting to look at your own hand and change how the shape of it from being a flat hand, which is the first step, to getting a little bit more complicated. Now, something you might want to try is if we think about this palm and the next thing where our knuckles are. So we've got a knuckle, oops. We've got a knuckle here, 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 and here. The next thing we're going to think about is using that template and thinking about doing a thumbs up. Then thinking what the thumb might do. A little bit crooked. As that modifies. So if you can see, I did it that way around. Okay, so that I think is the first way to change from the flat hand to something a little bit more simpler. And obviously it's going to be easier doing the back of your hand than it is going to be doing the front of your hand when you can do fingers, when you can see the fingers. So once you can see the fingers, maybe that's the second thing that you could try. Okay, so the next one I'm going to try is, I'm going to get rid of that layer. And I'm going to think about doing a peace sign. So think about changing, sorry, I keep doing that the right. Oops. So think about, look at your hand, look at where the knuckle comes, go round the finger and think about the inside shape and the outside shape, the gap that your fingers make, and then come back round the edge of the finger. And then the thumb is concealed here. So you don't really see much of the thumb because it's tucked behind the hand. And then we might see a bit of knuckle here and then a bit more hand here. The other thing is, of course, you can work that from the other way around. So you could start thinking about, it's a little bit difficult because I've done it the other way round, because I can't, if I was to do it that way round or that way round, then it depends which hand you draw with, whether you're left-handed or right-handed. But you could maybe start to think about how you could use the other side of your hand if you want to get a bit more complicated, and think about where your thumb is. I'm trying to do this back to front. It's really difficult. And then think about where the fingers come. To try and make just the very, this is progression from the very simple flat hand to something like a thumbs up to something like a peace sign. I think why that will help you, I think, is because they're quite recognizable hand patterns. And when we get into something more complicated, like in a portrait, sometimes you see hands folded like this. And I tell you, that makes me really scared when I see hands like that. Don't start with something like that. Start with something much, much simpler. What I want to get you to think about is, when you're doing a portrait like this, think about, I want to show you this painting by Lucian Freud. Okay, so, and I want you to focus on this amazing hand that he drew here. So the hand part, I think, is done really amazingly well. And then if we look at the foot there, so the foot isn't really handled in the same way. And I don't know if it's about time, but the thing here that I think is interesting is, because the foot is given such a light treatment, our eye isn't drawn to it. And I think when we tend to have things like hands and feet that we panic about, if we overwork them, then our eye will be drawn to them because maybe the line will be heavier. So here, really, really try and think very carefully about, if this isn't your forte, if this isn't your strongest point in painting or drawing, just maybe think about a really, really light touch when it comes to drawing hands and feet. And kind of less is more here. So that's an amazing hand, I think. And I think Lucian Freud's paintings are really, really good examples of life painting, because they look kind of so fleshy and raw, but also the drawing in them is absolutely amazing. So there's very, very few marks actually in that hand, but it's like super economic. So it's really, really brilliant, I think. Right, let's move on to feet. Right, what I want to do is next, I'll come back here. I'm going to see if I can plug this in next. Okay, so this is my camera, and you can see I've got some cheese there, and I've got some knife. I've got a knife to use. Right, so this is partly the challenge, but also partly the second section, which is about drawing feet. So hopefully this makes some sense to you. Right, I'm going to need to stand up to do this next bit. Right, so what I want you to do, I want you to get a piece of cheese. The cheese that I'm using is Cornish cheddar, but you can use any cheese, probably not too crumbly. This might actually be a bit too crumbly. Then from the wedge, I want you to cut out a part like this. Okay, so remove that part. So you've got this wedge shape here, and that's going to be what we're going to, oops, sorry. That's what we're going to use for our foot. Hopefully you can still see that. And then here, I'm going to cut out a little tiny piece. I might eat that. Okay, so that's kind of all I want you to do in terms of thinking about the piece of cheese. So get a piece of cheese out of your fridge if you've still got one. And, excuse me, delicious. When you've got that wedge shape, just cut a piece off. So if you can see here, that's the sliver that I cut off. Okay, and I'll explain how that's going to work in a minute. So I wonder if I can do this quickly. So if I take that out, what happens if I go back there? Do you see that? Now my computer's going to crash because I did something naughty. Right, I was trying to swap between screens really quickly. Okay, so what I want you to see is that I have drawn a little diagram of what I've just done. So I had a parallel-sided wedge of cheese, and I've cut a small part off it. So this is the part that I'm left with here, and then this is the part that I'm taking away. And you can see how that wedge of cheese fits into the form of a foot. So the hand drawing was much more about the shape of that palm or the back of your hand, first of all, but this is much more about form. So again, feet can be really, really complicated. So just next time you're looking at some feet, either when you're doing a painting or a drawing or just anyway, try and just see them as a wedge of cheese and see if that helps you to understand what's going on. So that's a diagram of what I've just done, cutting that piece of cheese. Right, if we move on here, it's all very well if you've got a very, very easy angle, like I just showed you from that first drawing of the foot from sideways. But I think if you've got something much more difficult here, because we have foreshortening, which I'll cover in another tutorial later on, it becomes much more difficult. But what I can do here, I can still draw over the top of this with a smaller brush. I can still draw that wedge shape. So there's that wedge shape back again. And the foot roughly still fits into that. You have the heel, you have the ankle, and then you have the toes. I'm going to start that from and try and do a drawing of my own by starting with the piece of cheese that I've got. So let's start with drawing the, I'm going to just change the angle a little bit so I've got it facing towards me. Right, so if I think about, what's the pen doing here? That's kind of okay, but let's just change that to a pencil. Okay, what's that like? Better. Okay, right, so I'm going to just draw the framework that I have in front of me, the wedge of cheese that I just cut for you. Oops. And then there's the cut. Okay, so that's what I had in terms of a piece of cheese. Now, if I then, on top of that, start to think about drawing a foot, I've got several considerations. I've got this part here, which is where the big toe is. I've got this part where the foot joins the rest of the leg. I've got the heel here. And when you're cutting this, really look at the shape of your feet and look at how they're a mirror pair. So look at the similarities. but also think about where the little toe is, might be slightly lower than where the big toe is. So I'm going to have to make a few little moderations here in terms of modifications, in terms of how I go about drawing. But really the first thing I think that I can think about is where that big toe might be. Okay, so already I'm kind of thinking, okay, well, the big toe might be there. And then thinking, well, okay, the heel, my heel part, obviously if this box goes down a little bit further, I've got to think about where the heel might be in relation to that. So I guess the heel is going to be, actually, I'll keep that there. The heel's going to be somewhere there on the floor. And then I have the ankle here. And then I can start to think 1, 2, 3, actually, I'm going to go back a little bit further. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's the arch of the foot, ball of the foot, and then the toe. And then that's maybe how a foot would fit onto a leg. Now, at the moment, that's very kind of outliney. And although that wedge of cheese is quite three-dimensional because it represents a box, in the same way as I was trying to simplify the hand, the wedge of cheese or the wireframe drawing that I've done is about trying to think, well, any shape, no matter how complex it is, can fit into a much simpler shape. So whilst a foot is extremely complicated and a hand is extremely complicated, just try and avoid that panic by thinking, how can I simplify it? How can I make that really complicated form fit in a much more simple form? So that's what I'm trying to show you here a little bit. And I think we have that very basic form, but then I'm also thinking that the way that a foot, we know that at that, where the toes are, a foot is much flatter than as it goes up towards the ankle. So really try and think about how that form might change as we go around up to where the ankles are. So just with those few lines, I think you can start to see that you can have a foot coming towards you based on that wedge of cheese. And then I guess we could put a little bit more detail in here. But I'm not super confident with drawing hands and feet. I think feet may be a bit easier for me than hands. But like I was saying, if you're not confident with something, then don't overwork it. Don't draw loads of attention to it in the image that you're making by overdoing it. So a light touch. So here, I think I probably wouldn't do much more than just those few suggestive lines to show the correct proportion, the correct position in terms of the rest of the body, and just make sure there's a big toe and four toes next to it. So I think less is more with something that you're not super confident with. So hopefully that explains a little bit what I was trying to get at in terms of the cheese and a foot. So the wedge shape is what's really important. So if we look, that's the wedge shape that I started with, and then that's the drawing on top. So I don't think you can do this with all parts of the body, but I think with hands, you've got that irregular four-sided shape to start off with. And I think then with feet, you've got this wedge shape, which might help. All I'm trying to think really is of what things might help you get better at understanding the world, looking at it and seeing it and drawing it. I'm going to just have a look at some comments here. Hello to Northumberland. That's okay that you're late. Yes, my hands are very rough and dry also from washing. Yes, so thanks, Rick, for your comment there at the end. I think sculpture is what we're going to concentrate on for this challenge. So what I would like you to do, I would like to see you sculpt a foot from a piece of cheese. So I'm really winding up the the pressure here in terms of your creative output. So get a piece of cheese. It's a foot. Remember, it doesn't have to be life size. This is probably half size. This looks like a child's foot. I'd say that looks like a 2 or 3 year old's foot, the piece of cheese that I've got. Doesn't matter how big it is, but just have a go at doing that first cut. And then, yeah, I can't really show you it. I've got it here actually. There's the piece of cheese there. So think about that first cut and then making the space for the big toe, and then thinking about that as a very, very basic and crude form within which you can try and draw a foot. So this is a drawing exercise, but the challenge is a sculpture exercise. I'd really, really like to see some cheese feet sculpted, please. So give it a go. I think the cheese that I've got here is a bit crumbly. I think a mild cheddar will probably work better because it's a little bit more elastic and doesn't crumble so much. But I think any cheese will work. Somebody asked me if you could use anything else. You might be able to use butter. I just think it's kind of funnier to use cheese, right? Because cheese and feet always seem to go together. Right, so I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. Hope it made some sense. Again, this is just the way that I see things, and I'm just trying to do this to hopefully get you guys to look at the world differently, to see things differently and interpret them in your own way through drawing. So it's not about really teaching you technique of drawing in most of these art lessons. It's mainly teaching you to look differently and look at the world in a new way. So hopefully that was interesting for you, and I will see you next time.